In 2011, a tiny green atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was overrun by more than 30,000 rats. They were in the trees. They were on the ground. They were eating seabird eggs, chewing through seedlings, and quietly stopping an entire forest from replacing itself. So conservation teams did something drastic. They removed the rats from the entire atoll. And then something happened that scientists had been waiting years to see. The forest floor, once almost empty of young native trees, began to change. Tiny green seedlings started appearing where researchers had found none before. Crabs returned. Insects came back. Birds began to reclaim space that had been stolen from them for generations. But that was only the first surprise. Because when the rats disappeared, Palmyra Atoll did not simply return to the way it used to be. Something else took root too. Something fast-growing, aggressive, and capable of smothering the very native forest scientists were trying to save. This is the story of Palmyra Atoll, the remote island where removing 30,000 rats brought a rainforest back to life, and then revealed a much deeper truth about nature. Sometimes, saving an ecosystem is not like flipping a switch. It is more like repairing an old clock, where every gear is connected to another gear, and one missing piece can throw the whole thing out of rhythm. Palmyra Atoll sits far out in the central Pacific, about 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. From the air, it looks almost unreal. A ring of coral reef, bright blue lagoons, narrow strips of sand, and dense green forest rising out of the ocean. There are no cities here, no neighborhoods, no permanent town square. Just research stations, seabirds, crabs, palms, native trees, reef fish, and the kind of silence you only find in places far away from highways and streetlights. At first glance, Palmyra looks like a paradise that escaped the modern world. But that first glance is misleading. This atoll has been changed again and again. Native forests were cleared in some areas. Coconut palms spread across the landscape. During World War II, the United States military transformed Palmyra into a strategic outpost, building roads, structures, docks, and other infrastructure across a place that had once been ruled mostly by birds, crabs, trees, and tides. And somewhere in that altered world, rats arrived. Black rats are small enough to hide in cargo, ships, shelters, and supply lines. They are clever climbers, fast breeders, and on islands they can become devastating. On a continent, rats are part of a crowded world filled with predators, competitors, and diseases that help keep them in check. But on many remote islands, the native wildlife evolved without rats at all. That means the birds do not recognize them as the danger they are. The eggs have no defense. The chicks cannot escape. The seeds fall to the ground with no idea that a new predator is waiting. That is what happened on Palmyra. Over the decades, the rat population grew until tens of thousands of them were moving through the atoll. They ate eggs from seabirds that nested on the ground and in trees. They attacked chicks before they could fly. They chewed seeds. They destroyed seedlings. They competed with land crabs and fed on insects and other small creatures that were supposed to help keep the forest alive. The damage was not always dramatic in the way people expect. There was no single day when the forest collapsed. There was no huge fire, no giant wave, no obvious disaster that could be filmed from a helicopter. Instead, the atoll was being weakened quietly. A seed would fall. A rat would eat it. A chick would hatch. A rat would find it. A crab would try to feed. A rat would get there first. Year after year, the next generation of forest and wildlife was being taken before it had a chance to grow. And one tree showed the problem better than almost anything else. Pisonia grandis is not the kind of tree most people have heard of, but on Palmyra, it matters enormously. It is a native tropical tree with broad leaves and branching limbs that create nesting and roosting habitat for seabirds. Those birds are more than visitors. They are part of the island's nutrient system. Seabirds feed out over the ocean, then return to the trees. When they perch and nest, their droppings bring marine nutrients back onto the land. Those nutrients enrich the soil. Some of them wash back toward the reef, helping support the surrounding marine ecosystem. So, a Pisonia forest is not just a collection of trees, it is a bridge between the ocean and the land. Fish feed birds, birds feed forest, forest shelters birds, and the whole loop helps keep the atoll alive. But before the rats were removed, scientists studying Palmyra found something deeply worrying. The adult Pisonia trees were still there, but the next generation was almost missing. That is a dangerous kind of decline, because to an untrained eye, the forest can still look healthy. The trees are tall, the canopy is green, birds still pass overhead. But beneath the shade, the future is absent. No seedlings means no replacement. No replacement means that every storm, every fallen branch, every aging tree brings the forest a little closer to a point it cannot recover from. That is the kind of damage rats can cause. They do not need to cut down a forest. They only need to stop it from being born again. By the early 2000s, conservation managers understood that Palmyra had a rat problem that could not be ignored. But removing rats from a remote atoll is not like putting a few traps behind a shed. Palmyra is wet, hot, complicated, and full of non-target wildlife. The rats were not only on the ground, they climbed into the canopy, they moved through coconut palms, they fed in places where ordinary control methods would miss them. And with rats, missing even a few can mean failure. One surviving pregnant female, or one breeding pair hidden in the wrong patch of forest, can rebuild the population. Months or years of planning can be undone by a single animal slipping through. So the operation had to be precise. It took years of research, planning, environmental review, and coordination between conservation groups and government agencies. The goal was not simply to kill rats. The goal was to remove them while protecting the native species that still belonged on the atoll. That detail matters, because island restoration often sounds simple from far away. People hear, "remove invasive rats," and imagine a straightforward cleanup job. But on Palmyra, the very animals conservationists wanted to protect could also be at risk if the operation was careless. Land crabs might eat bait. Birds might investigate objects on the ground. Rain could ruin supplies. The ocean surrounded everything. The terrain was fractured into islets, lagoons, dense vegetation, coral rubble, and old military structures. The team had to think like rats, but also like birds, crabs, trees, and weather. And the stakes were very high. If the operation failed, the rats would remain. If it succeeded badly, native species could be harmed. But if it succeeded properly, Palmyra might become one of the clearest examples on Earth of what happens when an island is freed from a predator it never evolved to handle. So, in 2011, the rat removal began. On a map, Palmyra looks small. On the ground, during an eradication operation, it becomes huge. Every patch of vegetation matters. Every shoreline matters. Every tree crown matters. Bait had to reach areas where rats lived and moved. Old wartime structures had to be checked. Dense forest had to be covered. The operation had to work across the entire atoll, not just the easy parts. Because rats do not respect the boundaries people draw on maps. And for a while, nobody could celebrate.
That is another part of conservation work people do not always see. The dramatic action is only the beginning. The proof comes later, in monitoring, in searching, in waiting, in checking again and again for any sign that a rat survived. No tracks, no sightings, no fresh evidence, no chewing, no hidden population slowly rebuilding itself. After intense follow-up monitoring, Palmyra was confirmed rat-free. For the first time since the World War II era, the atoll could begin a new chapter without rats. And almost immediately, people on the ground began noticing changes. Not from the airplane window, not from satellite images, not in some instant transformation where the whole atoll suddenly changed color. The first signs were small. A different sound in the forest. More insect life. Crabs appearing where they had not been seen. Seedlings coming up in places where the ground had been strangely bare. For someone walking through the forest, those small changes were not small at all. They meant the island was breathing again. Imagine standing under towering Pisonia trees and looking down at the ground. Before, there had been almost no young Pisonia seedlings in the research transects. The adult trees stood like an aging generation with no children beneath them. Then, after the rats were removed, tiny seedlings began carpeting parts of the forest floor. That is the kind of sight that can change the way a scientist feels about an entire project. Because it is one thing to believe, on paper, that rats are suppressing native trees. It is another thing to remove the rats and watch the forest answer. Scientists later documented the change in detail. Native tree recruitment rose sharply. For 5 native tree species, including Pisonia grandis, counts went from fewer than 150 seedlings in the presence of rats to more than 7,700 seedlings 5 years after the rats were removed. For Pisonia grandis specifically, the contrast was even more striking. Before the rat removal, scientists found no Pisonia seedlings in all 55 sampled transects. After the rats were gone, seedlings appeared. This is where the story becomes bigger than Palmyra, because a seedling is not just a plant. A seedling is evidence. It tells you that a tree produced seed, that the seed survived long enough to germinate, that the first tender leaves were not eaten immediately, and that the forest has at least one more chance to continue itself. On Palmyra, each seedling was a tiny green witness saying the same thing. The rats had been holding the forest back, and once that pressure was removed, the forest still knew what to do. That is the part that stunned people. Not because nature recovered instantly in some magical way, but because the response was so visible, so fast, and so measurable after years of suppression. The atoll had not forgotten how to grow. It had been prevented from growing. But the recovery was not limited to trees. When rats vanished, other pieces of the island began shifting too. Land crabs, which had been pressured by rats, started appearing in greater numbers and variety. Crabs matter because they are not just strange island decorations walking sideways across the sand. They are ecosystem workers. They break down organic material. They move seeds. They help mix and process the forest floor. Insects and other small creatures began returning as well. People reported hearing crickets, seeing dragonflies, and noticing life in places that had seemed strangely quiet before. And then came one of the oddest side effects. The Asian tiger mosquito, an invasive mosquito species on Palmyra, disappeared after the rats were removed. That sounds almost impossible at first. What does a rat have to do with a mosquito? But ecology is full of invisible relationships. Mosquitoes need blood meals. On a remote atoll, the available animals matter. If an invasive mosquito is depending heavily on invasive rats for blood, then removing the rats can pull away the mosquito's support system. That is what made the Palmyra story so fascinating. The team did not set out to eradicate a mosquito. They set out to remove rats. But by taking away the rats, they also removed a key resource for another invader. One unwanted species vanished, and another disappeared with it. That is the kind of chain reaction that makes island restoration so powerful. It is also what makes it unpredictable, because the same removal that helped native seedlings also created a new problem. If you are finding this story useful, subscribe for more nature recovery documentaries like this. These are the stories that show how one decision, one species, and one damaged place can reveal how the whole planet works. Now back on Palmyra, the forest floor was changing fast, and not every seedling that appeared was native. The rats had been eating seeds and young plants from native trees, but they had also been eating coconuts and young coconut palms. That meant the rats were doing something strange. They were damaging the native forest, but at the same time they were accidentally holding back another invasive problem. Coconut palms. To many people, coconut palms look like the perfect island tree. They are beautiful. They lean over beaches. They appear on postcards, vacation ads, and old paintings of tropical paradise. But on Palmyra, dense stands of coconut palms can be a major ecological problem. They do not provide the same nesting structure for seabirds as native branching trees like Pisonia. They change the forest floor. They compete with native trees for resources. They can form thick, nearly single-species stands that push the atoll away from diverse native rainforest and toward something much simpler. Before the rat removal, rats were eating many of the coconuts before they could become new palms. After the rats disappeared, the coconuts had a clear path, and the palms surged. By 2016, just 5 years after the rat removal, conservationists estimated that Palmyra had tens of thousands of adult coconut palms and around 2 million coconut palm seedlings across the atoll's islands. Think about that for a second. The same project that opened the door for native forest recovery also opened the door for an invasive palm explosion. That is not a failure, it is a lesson. Nature is not a machine where one broken part is replaced and everything automatically works. It is a network. When you remove a force that has been shaping the system for decades, everything that force was suppressing can respond. The good responds. The bad responds. The hidden responds. And suddenly managers have a second battle on their hands. On Palmyra, that battle became rainforest restoration. The goal was no longer just removing rats. That was step one. The next step was helping native trees win the race against coconut palms. Conservation teams began removing huge numbers of coconut palms and seedlings, clearing space for native vegetation to return. They also worked to plant and support native trees where palms had dominated. This is where the story becomes especially important. Because some people imagine that if humans just stop interfering, damaged places always heal by themselves. Sometimes they do. But sometimes, humans have already changed the system so deeply that walking away simply allows the wrong species to take over. On Palmyra, the rats were gone, but the coconut palms were ready. So the question became, what kind of forest would the atoll become next? A native rainforest filled with seabirds, crabs, insects, and nutrient cycles linking land and sea? Or a simplified, palm-dominated landscape that looked tropical from a distance, but did not function like the original ecosystem? That difference matters more than appearances. A coconut palm forest can look green and alive, but not all green is equal. A native forest is built out of relationships. Seabirds nest in branching trees. Their guano feeds the soil. Nutrients move through plants, insects, crabs, and eventually toward the reef. Crabs process fallen material. Native seedlings replace aging trees. The atoll becomes a living exchange between ocean and land. A palm-dominated system can interrupt that. It can reduce nesting habitat. It can change decomposition. It can alter the nutrient flow. It can make it harder for native seedlings to establish. So, the miracle on Palmyra was real, but it was not simple. The rats were removed, native seedlings returned, and the atoll showed astonishing resilience. But the next chapter required patience, labor, and humility. By 2021, restoration teams had removed more than 1 million invasive coconut palms from Palmyra as part of the effort to bring back native rainforest. That number is almost hard to picture. 1 million palms, not 1 million rats, not 1 million insects. 1 million palms and seedlings removed so native trees could reclaim space. And in the middle of that work, something encouraging happened. Pisonia grandis produced a major seed event, spreading seeds across the atoll in numbers not seen in years. Field teams collected and grew seedlings, then planted native trees in places where palms had been cleared. The atoll was not just being protected from something, it was being guided toward something. A forest that could support birds again. A forest that could feed the soil again. A forest that could link the reef and the land again. That is the deeper reason scientists care so much about Palmyra. It is not only a remote island with a rat story, it is a living laboratory for restoration. Because islands are easier to understand than continents in some ways. Their boundaries are clear. Their species lists are shorter. Their food webs are still complicated, but they are contained enough that scientists can watch changes unfold after a major intervention. When rats are removed from a continent, the effects can be hard to isolate. When rats are removed from a remote atoll, the response can be measured in seedlings, crabs, birds, insects, and even mosquitoes. Palmyra shows that removing invasive predators can do more than save individual animals. It can restart processes. It can allow seeds to survive. It can allow birds to nest. It can allow crabs to return. It can change which insects live there. It can even reshape the relationship between forest and reef. That last part is easy to miss, so it is worth slowing down. A seabird flying over the Pacific may feed on fish far from shore. Then it returns to Palmyra and rests in a native tree. Its droppings fall to the ground. Those nutrients enter the soil. Plants take them up. Some nutrients move outward, toward the lagoon and reef. So when rats eat seabird eggs and chicks, they are not just reducing bird numbers. They are weakening a nutrient pipeline between ocean and land. When rats stop native trees from regenerating, they are not just killing plants. They are reducing future nesting habitat for birds that help feed the island. And when coconut palms replace native forest, they can change where birds nest, how nutrients move, and how the atoll functions. Everything is connected. That phrase gets used so often it can sound empty. But on Palmyra, you can almost see it. A rat eats a seed. A tree fails to grow. A bird loses a nesting place. The soil receives fewer nutrients. The reef loses part of a land-based support system. A crab population shrinks. A mosquito finds a blood source. A palm seed survives. A forest changes. This is not theory sitting in a textbook. It is a chain of events written across an island. And that is why the return of seedlings mattered so much. Those tiny plants were not just botanical details. They were signs that the chain was being repaired. Still, Palmyra's recovery also warns us against simple stories. It would be easy to say the rats were bad, the humans removed them, and the island healed. That version is satisfying, but incomplete. The truth is more useful. The rats were devastating, but they had also been suppressing coconut palms. Removing them released native trees and invasive palms at the same time, so restoration had to continue. Managers had to respond to the second wave of change. Scientists had to watch not only what improved, but also what could go wrong next. That is real conservation. Not a perfect, happy ending. A living process. A damaged system begins to recover, but recovery has to be defended. There is something almost hopeful about that, because it means ecosystems are not always as fragile as they look. Palmyra had been altered by war, invaded by rats, pressured by palms, and pushed out of balance for decades. And yet, when one major pressure was removed, the atoll responded. The forest floor still had potential. The birds still had a place to return. The crabs still had a role. The soil still had a memory of what it could support. Nature did not need to be invented from scratch. It needed a chance. For older viewers, this story may also feel familiar in a different way. Anyone who has tended a garden knows that recovery is rarely just one job. You pull one weed and another appears. You prune one branch and the plant responds somewhere else. You stop one pest and suddenly you notice a second problem that had been hidden underneath. A landscape teaches patience. Palmyra teaches that same lesson at the scale of an entire atoll. The first victory was removing the rats. The second was recognizing that the palms could not be ignored. The third is still unfolding. As native trees grow, birds return, scientists monitor soil and roots, and managers try to restore a forest strong enough to face a warming ocean, rising seas, and future storms. Because Palmyra is not sealed away from the world. Climate change still matters here. Sea level rise matters. Ocean temperature matters. Coral reef health matters. The atoll's future depends not only on removing invaders, but on rebuilding resilience. That word, resilience, gets used a lot. But on Palmyra, it has a practical meaning. A resilient atoll is one where native forest can regenerate, where seabirds can nest, where crabs and insects can do their quiet work, where nutrients move between ocean and land, where one disturbance does not automatically collapse the whole system. That is what the restoration work is trying to rebuild. And the most remarkable part is that some of the evidence is only a few inches tall. A seedling on the forest floor does not look dramatic. It does not roar, fly, or glow. It can be missed by anyone walking too quickly. But after years of rats eating seeds and seedlings, that tiny plant means the future has reopened. Before the rats were removed, parts of Palmyra's native forest looked like an old family with no children. Afterward, the children appeared. Thousands of them. Some would die, some would be shaded out, some would be eaten by crabs, some would lose the race to palms if managers did not intervene, but some would survive. And those survivors would become branches. Branches would become nesting places. Nesting places would bring birds. Birds would bring nutrients. Nutrients would feed the forest and the reef. That is how an atoll begins to heal. Not all at once, not perfectly, but step by step, seed by seed, season by season. The story of Palmyra Atoll is not just about 30,000 rats being removed from a remote island. It is about what was waiting underneath the damage. A forest that could still respond. A bird colony that could still grow. A crab community that could still return. A scientific lesson that could help other islands around the world.
And one uncomfortable truth. When humans damage an ecosystem, leaving it alone is not always enough. Sometimes we have to go back, undo what was introduced, and keep working long after the first victory. Because the first green shoots are not the end of restoration. They are the beginning. Palmyra's forest floor once told scientists that something was wrong. No seedlings, chewed seeds, missing generations, a silence under the trees where the future should have been. After the rats were gone, that same forest floor began telling a different story. Tiny Pisonia seedlings pushed up through the leaf litter. Crabs moved through the understory. Insects returned to the soundscape. Birds circled above the canopy. And beyond the trees, the reef still shimmered in the blue Pacific, connected to the forest in ways most people would never see from a postcard. That is what took root after the rats were removed. Not just trees, a second chance. And maybe that is why scientists were so stunned. Because Palmyra proved that even after decades of damage, an island can still remember how to be alive. If you want another story about how one missing animal can change an entire landscape, click the video on screen now. And subscribe for more calm, surprising nature documentaries like this one.